I've just bought myself a piece of plywood from the hardware store, made from pine, to make 2 painting boards with. This is the best type of board to use as painting board. The size is 60 by 90 centimeters, or roughly 2 by 3 feet. You can see at the edges that it's 5 ply, which means it's made up of 5 really thin layers of wood sandwiched together. 5 is the minimum number of layers you need to prevent warping of your boards, speaking from experience. It's 7 millimeters thick, or about 1/3 of an inch, and you can get slightly thicker board too. I think for a larger painting, I would probably recommend a slightly thicker board. I'm measuring it up for cutting. I'm just going to halve the board, so I end up with 2 boards of 45 by 60 centimeters each, or 18 by 24 inches. I'm measuring to check that both sides match for accuracy. You know what they say, measure twice, cut once, cry never. I'm now going to cut this using my trusty jigsaw. Here we go. Just kidding. Let's go outside. I've got 2 plastic tubs set up that I'm going to use as my workbenches. Remember safety first when you're using power tools. I've got a dust mask, safety glasses, and earmuffs. And if your safety glasses haven't completely fogged up at this point, then you can make your cut. If you're not used to using power tools, I wouldn't recommend doing this yourself. Ask a friend who has more experience. Some hardware stores will actually cut the wood to size for you. My jigsaw blade tends to wander a bit from the grain in the wood, especially if the blade is a bit old, so my cuts are never entirely straight. I think I probably need to replace this blade because the cut is pretty wonky, but we can easily fix that. Rather than using only sandpaper and lots of muscle power, I'm going to use a pair of files because it's a lot easier and quicker. I start off with quite a coarse file, which has these tiny metal teeth covering the surface. I use that to straighten up my wonky edge. Then I'll switch to this finer file to smooth out the edge, and I'll finish off with some sandpaper. I'm now using some coarse sandpaper to smooth the sharp edges and corners of the board, and to smooth the surface also. 120 grade sandpaper works pretty well for this. I actually cut down the second board a bit more off camera and made it a bit smaller. I took another 5 centimeters off along the cut side, so it's now 40 by 60 centimeters, or 16 by 24 inches. The smaller board is the one that I've got here. Before you start applying a gesso priming layer, you need to prepare the board with a size layer first. Traditionally, rabbit skin glue was generally used as the size layer, but I'm using a thin coating of acrylic as a modern alternative. The size layer removes a bit of the absorbency from the wood surface and forms a slight barrier. It means that when you come to apply your gesso layer, it will adhere to the surface properly. If you're going to paint with oil paint, it also means that your wood doesn't get affected by the oil in the paint. This is a really important step, so don't miss this one. For the size, you can simply use an artist's water-based acrylic varnish by watering it down, or if need be, you can use a PVA wood glue and water that down. Here I'm using an acrylic gloss varnish. Acrylic satin varnish is also okay. And I'm mixing 1 part varnish with 1 part water. If I was using a PVA glue, I'd similarly mix it 1 part glue to 1 part water, depending a little on the thickness of your glue or varnish. You want your size to be very runny, almost like milk. Ultimately, I know I want to paint the edges of my painting board, so I'm coating the edges with the size coating as well. I've allowed the size layer to completely dry. Now it's time for the gesso priming. The traditional gesso used for paintings used to be made with rabbit skin glue and chalk. Acrylic gesso is a modern alternative and is simply a mixture of chalk and a water-based acrylic binder. This first layer of gesso that I apply is usually very thin so that it's easy to spread and it gets inside all the grooves and the texture of the wood surface. I'm making up a mixture of 1 part gesso and 1 part water, or in this case, 2 level tablespoons of each. I'm using distilled water, but you can just use tap water if you like. You need to mix it thoroughly to end up with something that resembles the consistency of runny custard. It's now ready to apply, or you can let it stand for a little while and it will thicken up very slightly. For the next coats of gesso, I want it to be a bit thicker. I'm adding another level tablespoon of gesso to the mixture that I still have left, which is about half of what I started off with. This will change the proportions to roughly 2 parts gesso to 1 part water. All the remaining gesso that I'm mixing up for this panel is also made with 2 parts gesso and 1 part water. I've waited for the first coat of gesso to dry completely before applying the second coat. The gesso is still a bit wet, so I'm using a hairdryer to dry it off further. You need to use a fairly cool setting for this and keep your hairdryer a good distance from the surface. Good rule of thumb is, if you can smell burnt plastic while you're doing this, then the setting is too hot and you're holding the hairdryer too close. Once I think the gesso is pretty dry, I run my hand over the surface because it helps me to check for damp patches. In places where the gesso is still slightly wet, it will feel quite cool to the touch. This is my third gesso layer. I tend to alternate the direction of my brush strokes between layers. First I was using vertical brush strokes, now I'm using horizontal strokes. This helps to prevent a distinct brush texture from developing in the surface. I'm also coating the edges of the board at this point because I plan to paint the edges of my board. I applied a fourth and a fifth gesso layer and sanded between the two coats. Okay, I finished applying all the priming layers. I'm just going to give the board one last thorough sanding, although the surface is already pretty smooth because I've applied the gesso in such thin, even layers and in multiple layers. In total, I've applied one very thin gesso layer to start and four slightly thicker gesso layers after that. As you can see, making your own painting boards is not difficult at all. It is a bit time consuming though. It's actually the perfect job to do when you've just finished a major painting project and you're sapped of creative energy, or towards the end of the day when you're running out of energy. I've prepared 2 boards this time, but the most efficient way to do it is by preparing about 3 or 4 boards all at the same time.